These talks today have been incredible, but I have some bad news. As you can probably tell, I'm a philosopher. It actually gets worse than that. I'm a philosophy teacher. When I tell people this, they often find an excuse to leave the room. What I'm going to tell you today is this. Philosophy seems boring because we don't know its historical context. What I mean is this. It's only when we see the historical context of a text that we can see why its author cared about it. And it's only when we see why an author cared about a text that we can come to care about it, if our concerns are the same. Now, to show you what I mean, I want to give you two examples from the Republic, the greatest work of the philosopher Plato. These examples are, first, the Ship of State, and second, the Allegory of the Cave. But first, who was Plato? Well, Plato was a philosopher who lived more than 2,000 years ago in Greece. When he was a teenager, his hometown, Athens, went to war against Sparta and lost. This war, we call it the Peloponnesian War. It went disastrously for Athens, and it deeply colored how Plato saw his world, in the same way that, say, the Iraq War colors how we see our world. Let's go into a bit of detail. So, Plato witnessed Athens going to war in the name of democracy. Athens insisted it was defending itself from a tyrant and liberating those ruled by the tyrant. In reality, this was half true. The Athenians desperately wanted the resources that the tyrant controlled. It might be that their greed blinded them a bit. The war went, as I said, disastrously. The Athenians assumed victory would be swift, but they found themselves locked in this brutal war of attrition that they never really understood, and so they could never really win. In the end, they devastated not only the people they sought to liberate, but themselves as well. I'm wondering if some of you might find this narrative a bit familiar. More than 24 centuries separate the Peloponnesian War from our own time. But despite this, the situation Plato encountered was not so different than the one we encounter today. Because of this, Plato can still speak powerfully to our generation, if we know how to listen to him. I keep bringing up our generation. What does that mean? Well, politically, our generation seems to be defined by two things. On the left, my left, we have the Occupy movement. On the right, we have the Tea Party. Now, these are usually taken to be opposites, right? They're considered to be the most extreme and therefore, let's say, the least convincing elements in their respective parties. At their worst, they definitely are. But at their best, it seems that each might be channeling the same insight, right? This anxiety that we no longer rule ourselves. Specifically, to vote either Democrat or Republican is to choose a kind of slavery, let's say, whether to the surveillance state on the one hand or wealthy corporations on the other. This is the worry. And let me give you two examples that motivate this. So, start with the left. Edward Snowden revealed that the Obama administration allows the NSA to collect data on millions of individuals. Slightly worrisome. But hey, look at the right. We have a conservative Supreme Court in the Citizens United case giving wealthy corporations tremendous, unprecedented power over the course of elections. Political affiliation seems not to matter much here. This is what to pick up on. Both sides ask us to trust that a handful of elites know what they're doing and have our best interests at heart. Now, I don't know how many of you have been paying attention to politics lately, but this seems slightly implausible to me. You're supposed to laugh at that, but that's fine. So, I call my talk Plato and the 99%. Some of us have a slogan, we are the 99%. Others think the slogan is somewhat silly. Sometimes it is. But let's dig a little deeper. I think what the slogan is trying to say is this. The political divide between left and right seems to be in some way a red herring. The only political divide that seems to matter much at the end of the day is that between almost all of us, and the handful of elites of one kind or another who seem to be running things. Now, Plato warns us that it's not a good idea to trust that these elites know what they're doing, and it's certainly not a good idea to trust that they have our best interests at heart. Now, to show you that he thinks this, I want to go through two examples. First, the ship of state. Second, the allegory of the cave. So, first, the ship of state. Plato says Athens is like a ship sailing in circles. Its pilot has no idea where he's going. Why does the pilot have no idea where he's going? Well, he's not a very good pilot. How did he get the job? Well, he's really good at holding onto the wheel. He's really good at fighting off other potential pilots. Does this sound familiar? So Plato says that politicians are like this. We reward politicians because they're very good at telling us what we want to hear, not because they have the best ideas. Our society seems to be like this, right? Our politicians are geniuses at telling us what we want to hear. But very few of them seem to know much about history, biology, economics, to name a few. or so it seems. And in fact, it seems like our own ship of state has come dangerously close to crashing on the rocks of reality. If you want a recent example, look at the government shutdown of not so long ago. So let's move on to the second example, the allegory of the cave. This is a bit tricky, so bear with me. Plato says that we're like prisoners chained in a cave, or chained such that we can't even turn our heads. Because of this, all that we see, it's actually quite like a movie theater, all that we see are shadows on the wall of the cave. Now it's interesting, these shadows aren't cast by real things, but by fake things, specifically by statues. And these statues are carried around by a few of us who aren't chained. Because we never see the statues, we take the shadows for reality. And we end up seeing only the shadows that those who carry the statues want us to see. In the same way, people in our society seem to take as truth what they see on television or the internet. Just as in Plato's day, people took as truth what they saw in plays by comedians like Aristophanes. We're not so different than the Athenians in this, right? We believe what we do all too often, not because it's true, but because those who hold our chains want us to believe it, right? We forget all too often that what we see on television or in the internet is, for better or worse, a construction. Plato warns us that unless we turn around and see the narrative being constructed, unless we undergo a kind of conversion, we'll remain chained to this narrative that's produced for our sake, right? So, these two examples, the ship of state and the allegory of the cave, leave us with two political questions. First, do the people in charge know what they're doing? Or are they merely good at telling us what we want to hear? And second, do we believe what we do because it's true, or merely because those in charge want us to believe it? I hope I've convinced you that these questions aren't less relevant to our generation than they were to Plato's generation. Now, I said they're political questions, and they are. But I'd like to try to hint that we shouldn't try to answer them by voting Democrat or Republican. I take my inspiration in this from Plato. Plato was a revolutionary. Now, this is kind of difficult to see, because Plato didn't want to shift politics left or right. Instead, he wanted to shift the way people thought about politics. He wanted people to ask whether anyone on the left or the right knew what they were doing. In short, he wanted people to think for themselves. Our revolution, insofar as TEDx constitutes a revolution, we should be revolutionary just this way. Instead of voting Democrat or Republican, we should reject the choice, I say, and we should question the narrative presented by each party. We too should learn to think for ourselves. Doing this would be to launch a revolution, not of violence or anything like that, but of something that I hope can be even more powerful, ideas. Whether or not I've convinced you of this today, I hope I've convinced you of one thing at least. Philosophy doesn't have to be boring if you see where its authors are coming from, if you see that their concerns might be not so different than our own. Thank you.